Today, we're talking about the global art market, which is not conventionally a problem that you would think about when we talk about other global justice problems. But we would argue that there is a profound reason to be concerned. First of all, as long as there have been human societies, we have had at least a handful of us have been concerned not just with feeding ourselves and reproducing, but they've also taken the time out from the necessities of life to scribble on walls and to make statuary and other kinds of monuments, some of which were religious, and some of which were just for their own enjoyment. But I think it's a profound human tradition, and we need to honor it and understand the tradition and how it's being affected by the economics of the market, because there have been significant changes with global impacts that raise real questions about art. We're going to be exploring those impacts today. I will be talking here for about 15 minutes about the size and growth of the global art market as we know it. It's now become a globalized market, cuts across borders. There are many of the same kind of players and some of the same offshore issues that we've encountered in other areas of the global haven industry, like tax dodging and fraud, and the problem of forgery and authentication, the problem of money laundering. These are all problems that have come to the surface in the last decade or so as the art market has expanded. If I could ask you to please turn off your own audio while you're listening to that. It's easier for us to record without background noise. Today, we're honored by having a couple outstanding guests and maybe a couple others who will show up. One is Alexandra Bregman. She's a distinguished author and art critic. She comes out of Columbia University background where she's worked and taught. She's an expert on some of the big players in the recent market, some of them who've been involved in various kinds of scandals and the headlines, including the world's largest, the record painting, the Salvador Mundi record art value, which sold for $450 million a few years ago. Both of us came at that story from different angles. I have a perspective based on having studied the Russian oligarch involved in that case, and Alexandra has a perspective based on some of the more art market specific transactions that have gone on at the same time. But we're very happy to have her here to share her wisdom. My friend Tony Pepitone is an actual practitioner in this area, and he's going to tell you an extraordinary story about having stumbled onto a Jackson Pollock painting about 16 years ago in the Hamptons. Bought it for probably what it was worth at that point, because nobody recognized it as a Pollock, and has since struggled to get the art world to recognize it. And he'll go into that in some detail. We were hoping today to have Peter Paul Bureau, who's a forensic scientist who specialized in the art market and is familiar with Tony's case and with a lot of other authentication issues in the art market that have really soared as the value of the market transactions has increased, and as some artists have become more prone to forgery than others. But Peter Paul is a victim of a bad vaccination experience, so he's been struggling with that over the last few days and couldn't be with us. And Edward Nahum, who is also a big gallery owner in New York, also couldn't be with us today, unfortunately. Anyway, let's just launch into the materials, and feel free to jump in with questions. Please raise your hand using the glories of Zoom to do so. Yale has a profound history in the art world, and I think it's important for us to kind of acknowledge that. It set up the first real U.S. art museum in the United States with a gift from the Revolutionary War veteran John Trumbull in 1831, who endowed the collection with in exchange for a $1,000 a year pension. It established the first U.S. School of Fine Arts at Yale in 1869. It had first graduate program in fine arts, which is a model for other universities. In 1960, it established the first general survey course for undergraduates, Introduction to Art History, from the Renaissance on, under the legendary professor Art Vince Scully, who was at Yale for 60 years and really had a tremendous impact on the way art education was handled at Yale. Harvard abolished its general art history course. I don't even remember having seen it when I was there. It was not nearly as widely regarded or highly regarded as the one at Yale, where Scully's own personal leadership made a huge difference. And just last year, the Professor Berenger decided to replace the Yale survey course with more of a menu of options for people. So it's no longer a required course. And so it's kind of faded out. But, you know, we're going to be picking up some of that slack and hoping to some interest some of you in the issues that we see as not only pertaining to art as a field in itself, but also the economics of art. When I was at Harvard in the 1960s, John Kenneth Galbraith was still there, and he was teaching a graduate seminar on this subject, the economics of art. We also had a guest documentary filmmaker, Emile D'Antonio, who made a film called Painter's Painting, which I highly recommend. And he captured one of the earliest collectors, one of the kind of the earliest mercenaries in the modern art world, a taxi cab owner in New York City named Robert Scull, who had collected a lot of Andy Warhols, Rauschenbergs, and many other artists who were relatively unknown at the time, and then started to have huge sort of dedicated auctions in this. Robert Rauschenberg, famous modern art artist, came up to Scull in the film and said, you know, the painting you just sold for $100,000, which was a lot of money back then. I gave it to you for $500. Where's my share? And Scull turned to him and said, sorry, pal, you know, you have a market for your stuff and I have a market for mine. And that's kind of the division that we're seeing here on a much larger scale. And it's beginning to affect, I believe, the artists as well as the collectors, the foundations, the appraisers, and the myriad of other people who are engaged in this business. So if we go all the way back to the beginning, we see art basically preceded economics and economic activities, certainly preceded farming. The earliest paintings, you know, and this is kind of a substitute, my attempt to substitute a little bit for the Yale General course. The earliest painting we've been able to find so far was just turned up in Blombos Caves in near Cape Town in 2018, 73,000, at least 73,000 years old. They were not signed, not authenticated, but we've been able to establish that the red ochre that was used was applied by humans to those rocks, and not for any you know, sort of utilitarian purpose. The second candidate is the Neanderthal paintings. It turns out the Neanderthals were quite active as painters and artists. They preceded the Homo sapiens, who left Africa much later. And they were in Europe 65,000 years ago, painting on the walls of this cave in Spain that we've determined was due to them. And then there are a couple other finds in the figurative art area. The earliest we found are two pieces of statuary and carvings from Germany, featured on the right here. Anyway, the point to make here is that this is you know, a pre-market kind of activity. You couldn't sell a cave painting. You probably couldn't even the figurative pieces, while they might have been tradable, it's not clear that there was any kind of active market for those either. The second thing to note here is a lot of these discoveries are very new. And so practically every 3 or 4 years, we're finding fundamentally new evidence on the dating and the aging. And I'm sure as this goes, process gets better and the forensic science is more effective, we will be able to achieve a lot more insights into this archaeology. But one of the key things they found, for example, is carbon dating can only take you back about 40,000 years. One of the insights that they made in the case of the Neanderthal paintings had to do with being able to analyze the chemistry of the fluids that are dripping in the cave and the thorium in those fluids and how much thorium there was. So that allows science to go way back. One of the themes of this presentation today is just that forensic science, while it has a lot to contribute to the art world, it isn't really recognized to this day as a full-blown alternative to the sort of subjective provenance assessment and sort of appreciation that most art authenticators still engage in. And it's a live controversy that has a lot to do with the problems that we're facing. So philosophers have always been somewhat ambivalent about art. I won't go through all of these guys, but poets, Marx, even Hegel, I think were somewhat, I would say, patronizing to the role of the artist. It didn't really count as the kind of full-blown reason. I don't know if, Thomas, you want to comment at this point, but this is your domain. But is it the case that artists and philosophers have had some tensions?
Yeah, they probably did have some tensions, but I'm not really an expert on that relationship. So I just leave it to you for the moment.
Okay. Well, the aesthetics is still a field in philosophy. And I think, there's a lot of issues about what art is that we'll leave to that discussion. But the existentialists were a little bit more positive toward the role of art. But in the economics world, we have, generally speaking, also had a difficult time fitting art into our traditional categories. The utilitarian focus, is terrific for intermediary goods that have a clear destination and use, or the basics of life. But when we try to explain why it is that people pay $200 million for a painting, then we're, sort of groping at straws. Of course, it's become a valuable asset. So there's asset speculation motives. Conspicuous consumption has been identified as a use. Our measures are also weak. There's a figure in the US GDP statistics for the art sector, which is 4% of GDP, which basically measures the service income from the cost side. Most art market measures don't really capture the growing role as an asset, and it's very poor data on the valuation of existing art wealth stocks. All the data does show, however, that regardless of how we measure it, there's been a dramatic takeoff of contemporary auctions, like I mentioned, the Scholes Angels auctions in the 1974 on. There was a boomlet in the 1980s, and then a crash in the 90s, especially for contemporary art. And then there's been this dramatic increase, as we've seen in global entry of players like China, dramatically affecting prices and the dominance of particular kinds of markets and auction houses. So we've gone from basically having a handful of markets with more of a focus on old masters with distinctive styles, which featured using art as a kind of enjoyable, not an asset investment, not something to be involved in financial transactions, certainly not something that many banks would become involved in financing. to a world in which there is much more interest in art as an alternative asset, with all kinds of the behaviors that are that are associated with that, including bubbles and the wider use of leverage, of bank financing. Very limited regulation still, despite this fundamental change. There's been a rise of high volume auction houses without internal experts trying to validate particular, basically they're auction houses that will handle paintings based simply on the market value, not worry about authenticity. And associated with that has been a growing organized crime role with whole dedicated studios producing the name brand artists and faking provenance. So many of the activities that we associate with other kinds of offshore haven behavior have turned up in the art world. So by one measure, the art market is, and these numbers need to be updated for the next 2 years, I apologize, it's been running about $68 to $100 billion a year. And I'm going to lose my power if I don't plug this in. There we go. Okay, good. But we suspect that this publicly recorded transactions are just a fraction of the total transactions, and the transactions have dramatically increased, especially since 2010. But we're talking about the official value of the art market is recorded by some of the analysts like Art Basel and UBS, which is a big Swiss bank that helps to finance these collections, is on the order of close to $100 billion a year now. Alexandra, do you want to comment on these numbers?
Yeah, so I wanted to comment on what you're saying, to update them the next 2 years, what that would look like.
Yeah.
Particularly 2020 was a very disruptive year. I don't think it's an accident that 2008 was like a big jump and then that kind of maintained for the next decade, because it was a recession store of wealth, a recession experimentation. The 2020 pandemic related recession did some really odd things to a lot of alternative investments. And I don't know how much you guys have been following the whole NFT boom, but I think UBS would have a hard time scaling the 2020 numbers, because on the one hand, a lot of their typical clients may have pulled back from some traditional art fairs or trading platforms. But on the other hand, those high net worth individuals were doing things they'd never done before, either on a private sales level in their communities, like in Palm Beach or in the Hamptons, trading amongst themselves, or in the case of crypto, going full speed ahead. So I don't know if it would be a great jump down or a great jump up or what, but even if it's the same, the type of behavior is slightly different.
Sure, well, that's very helpful. Explain for everybody what the NFTs are and what, just so we're not lost in acronyms here. There are a lot of acronyms that we can get into in the fintech area that lose people. So,
well, a non-fungible token is a sort of encryption that you can add either to a digital work of art or to a traditional work of art. I mean, you know a lot about this too, so maybe you'll want to jump in, but it's been applied more recently to digital art that's being sold for cryptocurrency. So I feel like if I go too deep into it, there'll be even more avenues. But the bottom line, what I meant when I said NFT was the general definition of a digital work of art that's being bought and sold with crypto, even if that's not the traditional definition of what a non-fungible token may be.
That's very helpful. 2020 was an interesting year for the stock market. We saw the gap between ordinary people and many internet billionaires soar. And so, one wonders when you get the art market consequences of that, we get some revisions of this kind of most recent data. We'll see, whether they were sticking us in the art market or whether they were holding back. Anyway, the trading market has also soared during this period, and I think what we're seeing is a contemporary. This is the contemporary art market. A lot more volumes that especially in the contemporary end of the market, which is modern art, post World War II. By market, by just some basic indicators of geographic origins, China has become a big player in the market. The United States and the UK still dominate, but China is grabbing share. And I think if we looked at the growth rate over time, we'd see that as well. And I think that's continued, especially as the Chinese economy outperforms. This is an indicator of those trends where China has, since the 2013 or so, has displaced the EU as a collective source of demand. Prices, this is stopped short of the 2020 period, so I'm curious about how these numbers would hold up. But art's been doing reasonably well compared with the S&P, but that's as an investment activity for contemporary art. And I think, again, this poses more questions than it answers, but we do see the rise of this alternative asset market. The other phenomenon here is the dominance of a relative handful of brand name artists, which has probably begun to Balloon Dogs, Basquiat, a number of the other name artists, Damien Hirst. Some of these people, if you watch the film that we recommended, Price of Everything, are not even, putting hands on to their artwork, not spending a lot of time on it. And it appears to be more of a factory kind of assembly. I guess, there were Italian artists back in the Renaissance that were doing the same thing with, meeting demand by having apprentices. So it may not be a complete difference of kind, but it does change the character of the market to have a handful of artists being dominated this. So here's an example of Jeff Koons's, celebrity, the celebrification of the art market, and the extraordinary values that has seen for auction turnover. Alexandra, is this continued, or is he over the hill now?
I don't know. I mean, what I wanted to jump in about is when you talk about those high net worth artists versus the S&P 500, that's a different conversation than art as a full-blown industry. Like the transactionality of a market play versus these, luxury items within that market. The article I wrote that I shared was about Masterworks, which is a company that's doing some alternative investment right now where you can cast your hat into the ring, whether that's a $10,000 hat or higher or what have you. I mean, the financial structure of that is deliberately gray, but you can say, I want to own a portion of a Basquiat or a portion of a Warhol because I know that they outperform the S&P 500. And that gets really crazy because you fully walk away from the ability to view and appreciate a work of art and you're merely following these charts. So there are a few asset tools that people use to track high net worth artists. One of them is the My Moses Index, and I believe that was purchased by Sotheby's a few years ago. I don't know if Art Price was using that same data, if they, if the banks are looking at it with their trusted estates clients pulling things together through those portfolios, but there are people who only look at the portfolios when they decide to make an art purchase or investment. And that's more and more becoming less opaque. It was previously a playground for the ultra rich, and now it's becoming something that's considered financially savvy.
That's helpful. I think the point that about the role of auction houses is something we want to come back to in making these markets the way they are. The other thing about the role of potential fintech solutions, we've had a session on fintech a couple of weeks ago, to getting equity, some equity in paintings to solve the Rauschenberg problem that I described initially. That typically artists don't retain equity in paintings that they sell, unlike people who may retain equity ownership in a company or in a piece of real estate. so that when the painting suddenly comes, to be worth 1,000 times what you sold it for, there's no retention of equity. So making, there are some attempts to develop institutions that will help artists participate in that kind of equity appreciation. Okay, let's go on to the role of the top artists' contribution to auction turnover. Seems to be some evidence that provided here that relatively handful of artists have been increasing their dominance in this market. Although, I mean, I would love to see the data from the last few years, but the extraordinary kind of concentration of turnover in the market among the brands, brand name artists. We've also seen side by side with that the dominance of modern art in the market has also increased compared to contemporary art or old masters. So or 19th century art. And here's some data on that. This is probably affecting then just the nature of the consumption that's going on for art collectors. Side by side with that, sorry.
I jumped in on you, I didn't raise my hand, but yeah. What's happening now is that the 20th and 21st century art is diverging. I think Christie's announced just a few weeks ago that they will no longer be doing post-war and contemporary as a shared category. They'll be doing 20th century art and 21st century art, because contemporary for the last 50 years was really just a hop, skip, and a jump from post-war chronologically. And as time goes by with this digital revolution and other things, I think they want to definitely expand upon exactly what you're saying, the Asian market, these digital collectors. It's quickly becoming something else.
Right. Great point. And by the way, if anybody wants to, I'm having a hard time seeing hands. So, it's the best thing is just to speak up. If you have questions, jump in and, don't be holding back here. But the online art and antiquities market is, also expanded during this period. I'm sure that these numbers need to be updated as well. Online art has taken off, especially with some of the NFTs, technology developments that have appeared in the last year or so, where authentication becomes easier, ostensibly. There's a whole technology debate raging now. NFTs have recently suffered a setback, but anyway, it's kind of the latest great big thing. But in principle, artists who were traditionally limited to a handful of channels when they were trying to reach out to wealthy investors, they'd have to go through special dealers or the auction houses. Now they're finding it somewhat easier potentially to get in touch directly, and there's a whole new shakeout, I would say, in terms of the online market, which is quite exciting. So some of the trends that we're seeing here are just driven by the extraordinary concentration of wealth. We've gone through these numbers in the past. I'm not going to go over them for this purpose of this course. But we've seen a tremendous expansion in the share of real world wealth that's been accounted for by the top 1% in the world economy. And when they turn around and ask what to spend it on, well, they can spend a certain amount of it on Maseratis and yachts and, an extra island in the Caribbean, a few extra houses. But at the end of the day, they like to fill the houses with expensive art. And so that has been one of the drivers. Art is one of the few outlets that, some of these folks feel they need. They could give it to charity. They could give it to fund oxygen tents in India, but this is where they like to put it. And I think that's a fundamental question that we don't really understand from a behavioral economics standpoint. It's hard to get access to these folks and ask them, why do you spend the way you spend? They're not interested in talking about it in many cases. But I think it is a basic phenomenon that we have to take into account. One of the reasons I was interested in, and I met up with Alexandra in the course, she wrote an outstanding a book about the fellow on the right, upper right-hand corner here, Dimitry Rivlov. 3 years ago, I surfaced I was looking at Donald Trump's connections with Russian oligarchs, especially his financial ones, which I think the Mueller investigation largely overlooked. And one of the characters who came to the surface was Dimitry Rivlov. To make a long story short, I will send you all the link to this article in the chat. But basically, he is the potash czar of Russia. He's since left the country and living in the Mediterranean. But he was, by different accounts, he was worth as much as $7 to $8 billion. He bought the Monaco sports team. He bought 10% of the Bank of Cyprus. He bought Donald Trump's house in 2008 at a strategic point when Trump needed $40 million and was about to go bankrupt. Rivlov suddenly shows up and buys out Trump. And in the 2016 election, we find his Airbus 319 bird dogging Trump's jet on the campaign trail. So he would go to Charlotte and Trump would show up, and he would go to Las Vegas, Trump would show up. So a very peculiar story that we never got the bottom to. His partner in the Bank of Cyprus was Trump's Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, another strange character. Anyway, quite out of the blue, it turns out that Rivlov became a major player in the art market. And I won't pretend to know more about this than Alexandra, who's written a whole book about it. But maybe you could enlighten us and just begin from scratch with the Salvador Mundi story and fill in what you want to say about it.
Okay, well, Salvatore with a T. He's not your Italian uncle, although I'm sure he'd be more fun if he was.
I don't have a picture of it. Do you have a picture of the painting by any chance?
I mean, I can pull one up. 1 second. Hold on. It was really kind of the end rather than the beginning. I think it was the end of the story for them and the beginning of the attention of others. The piece was sold in 2017 at auction at Christie's. I believe it was November 2017. But the relationship that procured it for, if I share the image, I'll lose the slides. Is that okay?
Okay. Yep.
Yes. So the relationship that procured the work between Rivlov and his art advisor, really art procurer of sorts, Yves Bouvier, began about a decade earlier in Switzerland, where at the time the Russian oligarch had moved to escape a variety of issues. One of them includes being previously incarcerated in Russia. Another is, potash business that ended up with a literal sinkhole. If you ever want to look that up, it's really staggering to see what happened to the company is literally a giant hole in the ground. I don't know. I learned a lot about environmental science looking at that. But Geneva was a refuge, and so was art. It was a refuge for his wife, who had been moving around, moved there, tried to settle in, and was looking for paintings to spruce up her new house, and also as a means to get to know people and really just make a more beautiful life. And it wasn't until the tail end of this relationship, I want to say 2012, that the Salvatore Mundi was purchased. The other thing that's interesting about this Leonardo da Vinci work, if you're an insider in the Leonardo scene, you refer to him by his first name, and da Vinci is seen as like a provincial way to refer to this masterpiece maker. But I like to say da Vinci because I'm a regular girl from America. But it deviates from the collection that Bouvier and Rivlov made together. So the majority of the works, I think it's 37 works in total, were paintings by Modigliani. So let's plug that in if you're not familiar. A very different look aesthetically, and particularly nude women. I think this might actually be the one, Nu au coussin bleu, nude on a blue cushion, that was in their collection. There are like 8 Modigliani paintings. So, I mean, just to answer your question, Jim, it was not the be all and end all for them. It was the end of that relationship that had to do with a lot of different kinds of art. What I will say, and what I often say about it, what makes it so interesting to me from that behavioral economics standpoint is that the Salvator Mundi is the savior of the world. That's what it means in Latin. And it's a motif that recurs. It actually, I think it has kind of a Byzantine look, which, people who are Eastern European really were so grateful that I acknowledge that, because if you ever go to a Greek Orthodox or a Russian Orthodox cathedral and you see that Byzantine gold saint icon image, it's reference to this kind of a template. But more importantly, this savior of the world thing is like the conqueror, the trophy to end all trophies. The subject of the work is trophy collecting by nature. So you're not just playing God through the acquisition, you're playing God through the subject matter itself. And I always just really enjoyed that component of the art market behavior. So that's all, yeah.
Are you familiar with the story, perhaps apocryphal, about how Oveloff learned about his allegedly being ripped off by his dealer?
Yes, I am aware of the official story on that. It's a very glamorous story, yes.
Involving St. Barts? I mean, is this something we can mention here, or is it?
Yeah, it was printed. It's definitely the cut and dry version of what happened. If you're a conspiracy theorist, you would have other ideas as to where and when it was discovered, but that is the official above board story, because it was very clear. There were many witnesses when the exchange occurred of, hey, how much did you pay for this painting? I paid this much. Wait a minute, I paid this much. Who took the difference? And that was really the crux of the scandal that is now known as the Bouvier Affair, which is the subject of my book. So yeah, that kind of, again, moving away from just how this Russian found himself at the heart of art history. Now we're talking about what went wrong in that relationship and why we know anything that we do about him. And the answer is that there was a defrauding situation, allegedly, fought out in court. I cannot say whether it was a criminal activity or not, but there was money that got lost along the way, to the tune of $1 billion in the end, that his art dealer or his art advisor, whatever you want to call this man who worked in Switzerland, which I'm sure we're about to get to, took $1 billion off the top of 37 art transactions.
That's helpful. I mean, to put this in perspective, you really have to remember who Oveloff is, and the complainant in this case, is a fellow who, as of 1995, was worth, not much. And somehow he became extraordinarily wealthy and became a leading player in this market by, certainly by 2008, 2009. And, so I mean, I guess in terms of unexplained wealth, the law that the Brits have on the books now, but we don't, that would be an interesting kind of speculative exercise to figure out exactly how he soared. Probably just sheer skill and entrepreneurial innovation. But
which man are you talking about? Both of them, or
Oveloff? Well, I don't know Bouvier's story. You've been
he made $1 billion off art transactions. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, that's impressive. But I mean, Bouvier's original accumulation was to go from zero to an anonymity to I guess he's still anonymous in some ways, but to at least $7 to $8 billion and a $2 billion art collection in kind of record time. Anyway, where does the case stand now? Maybe you could just fill us in on that particular case, and without taking sides in it, just say, what are the pros and cons of the different litigants?
So I have not been following the cases as closely as I did when I was writing. Yeah. My understanding right now is that almost every case against Bouvier has been closed out or, is done. He doesn't have to worry anymore. And the initial rage of the Russian was speared across the world, that, these two high power men, you can't just sue them in one place. You have to file the charges. The language in French is different, accused, being charged, it's all very complex, and different legal jurisdictions are very finicky about the language that you use. But there were actions taken in Asia, in Europe, and in the United States, all the playgrounds that they were working in. So Singapore had something that was thrown out. I believe Hong Kong may have as well. Monaco is the most famous one.
What does this tell you about the efficacy of using the courts as a way to resolve these kinds of controversies? And can we tell for a fact that this is a legitimate lawsuit that was sincerely filed, or was there a certain amount of role playing going on the part of the litigants?
What do you think?
Well, I'm not an expert on this case. I would say that in general, these kinds of big ticket litigants, when they go to war, it becomes quite conceivable that they will go beyond the limits of just what makes economic or rational legal sense in terms of trying to press this to the hilt and just, being ego involved. But there's other motives that might be come to bear here, sort of.
I mean, I think you could say that about any lawsuit. There's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that go into low-level lawsuits too. You have to make a decision for whatever reason, and your avarice might factor into that. And these are not normal people. This is not a normal playing field. If you're angry, you can amplify that. So is the question, what else were they angry about? I mean, I don't know. I'm just reporting what.
Oh, I guess the question is whether this is.
And I have my suspicions, but they're just suspicions.
Is this unusual behavior in the art world for these kinds of suits? And is this kind of an extreme case, or is this litigation happen all the time?
It does not happen all the time, or we would be talking about other people. I did speak to one art dealer who came to me hoping that I would tell her story, where she was accused of unfairly skimming a commission, and she was very eager to see what would happen in the Bouvier story because it could potentially allow her to revisit her case. I don't know of a lot. If this were a standard thing, you would all know about it every day. It would be like watching true crime for murder. You would just be like, oh, another art fraud case. No, I think that it was definitely bold of Rivlov to expose this world, especially because, as Jim mentions, anonymity is such a cachet if you want to know how to facilitate private sales in this underworld. I say underworld, I mean underground. It's literally behind closed doors, vaulted, closed. It's a very discreet situation. So if you take away that if you turn that into indiscretion, that's like the worst thing you could do to somebody, because then they'll never get that cachet back. But I don't think that's what happened to Bouvier. I think he managed in the end.
He was also a big owner of the freeports, was he not? And can you say a little bit about what freeports are and how they've come to be, and what the role in the art world has been?
So Yves Bouvier is not a traditional art advisor in the sense of someone that you maybe Tony will talk about later, people that have shops or have worked in that industry on the ground that you can walk into their place. The same way that Rivlov wasn't your typical art buyer. He and his wife started amassing these things through these very elite channels. Bouvier worked in and to build a freeport, which I guess the students don't know what that is at all.
No, you could give us a little background on what freeports are.
Okay. The origin of a freeport began in, I believe, the 1800s, more as we have come to know it. There were other iterations of it, but the 1800s is when, during the industrial era, the agricultural grains or goods that needed to go from one place to another had to be housed temporarily on their way. So, if I wanted grains from one end of the country to go to another end for some grocery store, whatever, anything that you needed to move from one end of a place to another had to be stored overnight. And you didn't want to have to pay taxes on it because it wasn't really there. It was in limbo on its way somewhere else. That law, that legal stipulation and standpoint became the evolution of what is now an art warehouse, where you don't necessarily have to pay a tax on the art while it's inside this freeport warehouse. Now, in the Geneva freeport, It's just a big group of warehouses, and some of them have free port designation with taxes and some do not. So a lot of people like to show that whenever they're being told that they're locking things away, they're saying, well, not everything is in my free port zone. Some of it's just in storage. But it's a very, at once, unsexy and sexy place because it's just underground, under lock and key, and yet anything could be there in terms of art history, in terms of your private collection. Now, the people who run these things are incredibly defensive and they're like, listen, this isn't tax fraud, this isn't illegal. We just want to house things. And if the government wants to come and check what it is, they are always welcome to come. You know, customs can come. It's sort of like, you know, the duty free of art. If you need to do an investigation, you can go right ahead. But it's not so easy to do that. And it's just basically a treasure chest. That's how I like to explain it. It's a tax favorable treasure chest where you can put things and save quite a bit of money versus if you had to pay various taxes on them. Now, another question people ask is which taxes, which is a very good question, but it also depends where you are. So in Europe, the VAT is the big one that people talk about, but any country that you're from, any place that you don't necessarily need the government knowing all of your business or your family knowing all of your business or the museums knowing all of your business, you have this discrete place to go.
And the biggest free ports, I mean, I know that Geneva and Zurich and Ticano have free ports traditionally, but we also have Singapore. Luxembourg has established a free port since the 80s. It's quite prominent. But I think there's one in New York. Is there not? In
Geneva is the historic free port, but the free port model has been applied other places as long as you get the zoning. There were rumors that Rivlov and Bouvier were attempting to build a free port in Monaco because as a principality, it would be a good place for that. The entirety of Hong Kong is apparently a free port zone. Singapore has its free port, as you mentioned. I believe, I know New York has one. They're all over.
And the UK
and
also,
Dubai has a big one, like the Emirates. People whisper about what's really going on in the Emirates. That's every time, especially in Geneva too, to be like, you think this is sketchy? Just check out Dubai. Just check out Kuwait. I'll never do that because I have no access to that.
Right. Tony, put your speaker on, Tony. Tony, you can't be heard.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Yeah.
So I have a question for Alexandra. I think one of the issues in the Russian lawsuit was that Yves Bouvier was inflating the values of the prices alongside of one of the major auction houses. So thereby they were creating a value that really, it was just a subjective value. It was a value that anybody could have said it's worth this, and they inflated the values on the guy. So if a painting was sold for $93 million and the hedge fund guy who got the $93 million, when they flipped the painting, they sold it for 127 million or 118 million. Who gave him that value? Who gave Bouvier the value? The auction house, correct?
The auction house backed up the value from what I understand, but the buyer gave him that value is the unfortunate answer. That's the contrarian gallery answer is you bought it. You set the value because you bought it. You know, jumping forward to the whole NFT thing that's happening right now where people are buying these digital works of art. They don't even know what they are. They don't even know where their money is going. But it seems cool. And if somebody told me that it's worth, 3 Ethereum, then I'm just going to throw it at that. So, I mean, what you're referring to is the most important remaining case between Rivlov and Bouvier, which is really against Sotheby's, because that's exactly what happened is Rivlov said, well, how did this go on? How was I getting papers from this auction house? They were allowing this to happen. And the counterpoint would be, that's just market making. The differential between the buy price and the sell price that ended up going to the dealer, that's just talent. Nobody asks how much your coffee's marked up at Starbucks. They don't care. Right. It's part of the experience. So again, that's what they say. You're providing the counterpoint to that.
The basic generalization here is that this is the Wild West in terms of free markets. I mean, there are none of the regulations that we take for granted in even the public securities market about disclosure, fair market value, minority interests, insider information, price fixing. None of these apply to the art market. It is, whatever you can get away with. And the basic sense of that is that, hey, these are rich people by and large. They can take care of themselves. So when it comes to court, it usually has to be in the guise of an argument that someone was violating a fiduciary responsibility. That if you were somebody's dealer, you have a responsibility not to, turn around and make obscene profits in a short period of time. So that was the argument. Let me turn to a different argument because time is short here. I want to go to the subsequent transaction, which we're now familiar with. Oveloff is complaining about, having been ripped off by Bouvier, but at the same time, he turns around and he figures out a way to sell this to the Saudi prince for $450 million. So let's talk about the history of the valuation of this painting from at least 2005 on. Do we have that kind of in our heads? Sort of there. I mean, there's a little bit of a sticker shock that goes on for me when I hear about the incredible revaluations of this painting in record time.
Well, part of that, I think, Jim, is the authenticity. The painting was purchased in an estate sale in New Orleans, from what I was told, for about $1,100. And
when was that?
Well, the dealer who purchased it from the family, I think it was 2005.
Yeah.
Right. And then they got the painting and took it and had it authenticated, and flipped that painting for, Alexandra, maybe 80 million.
I'm fact checking. I'll look.
Yeah, if you just did the price series, I think it's kind of interesting as a concrete example of the.
So the painting went from $1,100 in 2005 to somewhere in the vicinity of 80 million when it was sold to Bouvier, who then flipped it to the Russian for 127.5. Right?
Right.
He held on to it for a few years, and then a bidding war ensued at the auction house when it was allegedly fully authenticated. There's stories now, it's not truly a Da Vinci. It's.
Let's let Alexandra tell the story because this
Yeah.
is really something she's
Go
a
ahead.
leading expert on. So.
No, I mean, I'm not the leading expert on the origins of the Salvator Mundi. I would say that I interviewed people on both sides of the Bouvier and Rivlov scandal, but there are so many people in the Leonardo field. Like, I think I told you guys just now, like, they refer to him as Leonardo. It's gauche to call him Da Vinci. It's like a whole scene. I just rewatched the Da Vinci Code. I was like, yeah, I relate to this. Like, there's just like a whole world of people. So I don't necessarily associate myself. I just check the data on it. But yeah, so it was purchased in 2005 for less than 10,000, but all the other numbers were right. I'm looking at an art newspaper article about that. Yeah, I mean, like I said, what always struck me in terms of the Bouvier story was that it was so counter to the other works in the collection. But what we're really talking about now is how an artwork is valued and why, and whether it needs a fair market value. I mean, is that even really fair? Like, how much is the Frida Kahlo poster behind you worth to me versus to Tony versus to Thomas? We would probably all give you different values of how much we would pay for it versus a stock of a company. You could say, well, these are all the costs and these are all the revenues, and you can total it up. Only now are they starting to do that with the existing auction value of something. But it's not just totally like, okay, we gave up on rich people, they can do whatever. It's that for a very long time, and even to this day, you could argue that art valuation is subjective. Now, what Tony's talking about is forensics, because that's his specialty given what he's been through, which is a piece of wood that you find in Louisiana versus a beautifully restored Metropolitan Museum of Art authenticated piece. Those are going to have absolutely extremely different values. And that's what happened to this work. It was picked up as a nothing. And when it was decoded and stripped and painted back in, and all of the techniques that are used by, again, experts who are not me, it was revealed, the curtain was lifted, and lo and behold, this is a work by Leonardo da Vinci. But there is a lot of controversy around that now because the valuation went so high. Now, $450 million is more than any work has ever sold at auction in history, I believe. It's hard to say because sometimes the auctions, they'll send a press release and be like, this is the highest value, but they're always triangulating the language where they're like, this is the highest amount ever paid for a Picasso in London on a rainy day when wearing a raincoat. Like, I don't know, they're all the highest value ever, but I believe $450 million is truly record breaking. However, if you are calling it the male Mona Lisa, which a lot of marketing did, the Mona Lisa is valued much higher. So, then you pull back the psychology of that. Is it just the forensics? Is it the attitudes? Is it the hype around it? And is it the desire? Now, I would wager that in this particular case, it's not the desire because none of us could care less. Like, I don't know. I speak for myself. This painting does not speak to me as a holy work that I would give my left arm for. It's just a painting that has a really interesting history. So that's not it with this.
Do you have that clip?
Strong.
Do you have that trailer clip that you could just show people? Because
yes, so there is a film coming out that I'm not allowed to comment on, but I am allowed to show you the trailer. So I will do that. Hold on one second.
Okay. There's a number of great films. This will be a terrific film about this issue. If we can get it going.
So Jim, the other thing I'd like to add to that conversation is once the painting is assessed and valued, it goes from an $1,100 painting to a $450 million painting. Oh, here it is.
Yeah, let's listen to this.
I hope I don't have to change a setting for you to hear the sound. Just let me know if you can't hear it. Can you hear it?
Yes.
Yes. Is this the French film?
Yes.
No, it's another one.
It's a new one.
One evening, I am wrestling for, the 10th time with retouching a small loss, which is just above the lip, right here. And there is a transition in this area from the lip to the upper lip that is imperceptible. There is no line there, or the edge of the lip is exactly what is present in the same area of the Mona Lisa. My hands are shaking. No one except Leonardo could have painted this picture.
All right, so that was Diane Dwyer Modestini, who was the conservator for this work. So when people started saying, are you sure it's real? It was her work that they were calling into question.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that.
That's terrific. I mean, it raises all kinds of questions here but I would love to hear now just about the recent French government analysis of this painting. And, on the other side of the question, what is the Louvre, why did they decide not to show the painting next to the Leonardo? The Mona Lisa.
Talk to. So that's what Tony's referring to. There's another film that has been highly marketed recently. The director is Antoine Vitkin, and he's commenting. There are multiple theories. I mean, Tony, have you read all of them too?
Some of them, most of them.
But what is your perspective on the French government's position on this? What are they saying?
Basically? I think that it became a political battle alongside, the owner of the painting. He insisted that it was put alongside the Mona Lisa, and the Louvre declined to do that, and he refused to send the painting to the exhibition. Mm-hmm. It's, in my eyes, it's questionable. How can you say, well, he 10% painted the painting? Do you want to spend that kind of money on a painting and thinking maybe the artist touched it or maybe he didn't?
Alexandra, what do you think?
So just to be clear, what happened was once this woman, Diane Modestini, restored the work, people were saying, she did all the work. It never looked like that. Looking at the wooden panel that was found in Louisiana versus what she created out of thin air, according to the naked eye, there's no way it could be real. Now, the people that I've spoken to who, I mean, you don't sell a work for that kind of money if it's totally made up. I think people are really seeing this as a black and white issue, and it's unfair. There are decades of conservators who were the top in their field, specialists at the top in their field. They all authenticated it. I'm not going to tell you as a random person that's researched it that it's not real. Like, I'm just never going to be the person to say that. Another theory, though, is that it was not shown at the Louvre, not just for this political reason of placement, but because that 10% is not enough, that it wasn't a real, true Leonardo, and it didn't belong with the others. Personally, I think it's interesting that we're having this debate at all in the 21st century, that we have the forensic ability to nitpick something like this, that 100 years ago or even 40 years ago, they probably wouldn't have been able to do to this degree. So it is a very quantitative approach to a work of art that I've never heard in other debates. You know, with Caravaggio, there was a big scandal recently. They peel back the layers, they look. With Pollock, as I'm sure we'll get to, we talk about dating the paints and talking about authenticity, but this level of nuance in the discussion is just fascinating. And I still won't tell you whether I think it's real or not. Like I said, it doesn't speak to me as a work on its own. It certainly makes sense to me that it would be a Leonardo work, but I don't know.
One of the points here is that there's a, sort of, instead of looking at this as a digital issue, it's really more of an analog continuum. So somewhere between being 100% Leonardo and 0% Leonardo, there's a chance that, I have Al Weiwei is the Chinese artist, and he followed me on Twitter. And when this controversy came up the first time, he said, the reason that this was handled by the modern art department of Sotheby's was that 70% of the painting has been reconstructed. So regardless of whether you think that's enough to be a Da Vinci or not, I think that's one of the things we're underscoring here. I guess the other question I want to ask you, Alexandra, then we can go on to Tony. Why would the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia participate in this very public, sort of bilateral auction against his cousin, I think the Crown Prince of UAE, and spend so much money when there was only two people really bidding for this painting? I mean, what was that transaction about? Why would they not? Were they simply trying to figure out a way to get money to Rivlov? I mean, what's the possibilities here that come to mind? This kind of weird. You would think they had monopsony power, but they didn't choose to exercise it.
I could not tell you what Mohammed bin Salman was really doing. There are whole CIA files on that. I don't know. I can tell you from an art historical standpoint, from a behavioral economic standpoint, that, like I said, this is the trophy to end all trophies. The very subject is trophy. And if you're going to put all of your money into a work of art historically speaking, this would be a good one, because, you're the king of the king of the king. And it's also fascinating to me from an ideological standpoint, because it is a Christ and it is a Muslim ruler who decided to purchase this Latin language thing, which of course, by Leonardo da Vinci, I love to point out, was he's a non-binary homosexual. He would not be very welcome in Saudi Arabia, which is always kind of the dichotomy of art and its artist. To me, however, I do think that says something about the intent behind a changing era in Saudi Arabia, that Mohammed bin Salman initially really wanted to portray himself as, cult of personality, young, happening guy. He used social media for political gain. He, the whole women driving thing, he wanted to be the it girl of Saudi policy, and buying a Christ subject is, I think, another stake in that sand. So I can only speak about art historically, but I don't know commercially what was going on between these men. And frankly, it would be dangerous for me to know that.
Jim,
Yeah.
I just wanted to add to that. From what little research I did, it could have just been a battle of two, and apparently they didn't know they were bidding against each other. And like Alexandra says, when something's brought to auction and you have two very wealthy people after the same trophy, it's not out of the norm for it to go like that, you know, with that kind of money and backing. So it could have been the simple answer of why it exceeded that $400 million mark.
I mean, that's exactly the point, though, is it could be that because it's often that. And yet, if you had a nefarious intent, it would be a great vehicle because no one would suspect anything because that's the nature of that valuation process. But as to what that might be, I mean, that's your expertise as to offshoring and secret backdoor transactions that were now authenticated by something that's happening for everyone to watch.
That's helpful. I think, you know, we can all debate what this means or how important it is, but for me, it sort of dramatically you know, if Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia wanted to establish diplomatic relations with, you know, the younger generations of the world, there were a few things he might not have done that he did do, which would be a lot less expensive. So anyway, let's move on to you know, this question and a fascinating case about Pollock and valuation and authentication that you've experienced, Tony. And Alexandra, you can feel free to jump in here, and anyone else with questions about the craziness of the art market.
Yeah, please do, Alexandra.
Just take it from the
And I hope
basics.
the students do too. I like being interrupted by students.
Assume that we know nothing about Jackson Pollock, nothing about modern art, and you know, that we are, on the other hand, and not very much about forensic science as well. So,
Well, it's a great movie in 2000 by Ed Harris called Pollock. It gives you a total insight and a great performance, by the way, of Ed Harris. Marcia Gay Harden won the Academy Award, I believe, for Best Supporting Actress in that movie, played by his wife, Lee Krasner. So Pollock, for those who don't know, died in 1956 in a car accident in East Hampton. And he was the innovator of what we now know as the drip technique. There's been a lot of controversy with his paintings. There are many forgeries out there, people who mimicked him and stuff. And at the same time, there were a number of paintings that many believe escaped the catalog. The catalog raisonné was put together and finalized in 1979 by Francis O'Connor and Eugene Thor. Funny thing is, I had gone to a birthday party that was held at the Pollock House for Lee Krasner. It was her 100th birthday. And I met a gentleman there who was giving a speech by the name of James Valier. And he told me a story. In 1961, he was a young kid at a graduate school, and he was hired by Lee Krasner to begin to put this catalog together, catalog of works. And he said, here I am, this young guy in New York City, and I pick her up on Fifth Avenue, and I'm driving my little sports car, and we drive out to the Hamptons, and I'm thinking, wow, I'm gonna investigate one of the, greatest artists in history. And he was thrilled. And he says, I'm expecting to find, a barn load of material. And he says, I get there and there's nothing but a shoebox of material with a few names and, some stories that she told him. He says, what happened to all? She says, well, I threw most of the stuff out. So he says, imagine me calling on a dial phone, trying to track down these paintings. And a lot Krasner didn't know where they were. Pollock was known to have mistresses, and many affairs and supported a lot of this, shenanigans with selling artwork. Jim mentioned earlier there was a case where he sold the painting. He traded some of his paintings. So it was a tough situation to put together this catalog raisonné. But they began to do it, and I'll just read. I have something here, a book from a very rare book that was. It's a foreword by Eugene Thor for a show by L&M Fine Arts in around 1991, and it says this: in spite of his fame, aspects of Jackson Pollock's works are still not very well known. To the art historian writing a history of 20th century painting, or to the college professor teaching a survey course, Pollock was the revolutionary dripper or pourer of paint onto very large world-sized canvas. He was the man who reinvented the idea of painting, performing a kind of wild dance which allowed the artist unconscious to paint the picture. His violent death is in the famous automobile accident, and his biographers emphasize on his drinking and unstable personality, have imposed stereotypes about him and his work. Along with that, throughout the years, we researched, well, for those of you who don't know, this is the painting in the background that I had purchased at an estate sale in Watermill in 2005. It was just a sunny day. I was going home from work. Something I often do is stop at these sales. An elderly woman came out. I asked her a few questions. I asked if she had any artwork. And she says, well, I had some. I sold some earlier, but she said, well, she had this canvas in the back of the garage covered. And we took it. I said, this is a beautiful painting. I would love to have this for my son's room. She says, oh, that crazy painting, my brother had it. And I used to ask him about it, and he would say, don't go there, Mary. So she inherited this painting, this house, along with other paintings and a number of homes. I took the painting home. We hung it for a while. My wife at the time goes, oh my God, I did a study on this guy, Jackson Pollock. I really didn't know who he was. Lived in East Hampton, not far from her house. And so this journey began, this journey to find out where this painting may have come from. At that point, I had there was a movie that was being made about a woman in California. It's called The Terry Horton Painting. And it was showing in East Hampton, not far from where we live. We went out to see it, and lo and behold, it was quite similar to the painting on the screen, this drip painting, colorful painting. As time went on, we began to as we looked at the painting more, there was something different about this painting. Not only was it beautiful, it was just something that would draw you in every time you looked at it. A couple of years went by, and I reached out to the gentleman in the movie, Peter Paul Biro, who in the movie was allowed to go into the studio and take paint samples from the floor in Pollock's studio. Now, understand a little bit about this. What we found out was in around 1954, Jackson Pollock and his wife replaced the floor in his studio with like a tile type of floor. So all of his drips and all of the chemicals from the painting, all of the pigments or any DNA that may have been involved in that floor was basically preserved. That floor in that studio, you could still go visit that. I see this woman over here nodding. She apparently knows this. So now we begin to realize they were building a database for the chemicals on his paintings. Makes sense. In 1984, Krasner dies, donates the the home and barn to Stony Brook University, who spends about 2 years excavating that floor. And there it is. It was preserved and very similar. The way it was explained to me was, if you're waxing your floor in your kitchen and a piece of hair follicle falls off and you cover it up, it's preserved. Your DNA is in that floor. Well, they had this evidence and the chemicals from these paints. So we sent a few images to the gentleman in Canada, who was very, very professional, and saying, look, I don't know if it is or isn't. You're welcome to bring it up. We can do some testing on it. And we did. The initial testing lasted a few days. And about a week, we took the painting back. About a week later, I got an email saying that, you know, we don't know, but the first layer of this particular painting is dated from the period. Now, the painting itself is about 8 layers deep. So because of the paint on the outside testing positive for during Pollock's lifetime, meaning that in 1956, you want to know that the chemicals from that floor, that painting, are preserved, or at least from the period of the artist. So without further, we further went to about, I believe it was in the meantime, I want you to know, we began to investigate the provenance of the painting. I was advised by a very, very well-to-do, well-known lawyer to go back, and he went back to the property with me and he said, you really need to find out about this guy. And so we did, and we sat in for a luncheon. The woman's name was Mary Ryan. We knocked on the door, we set this luncheon up, and we went to see her, and she said, look, I really don't know. She said, I'll be quite honest with you. My brother got sick with the AIDS virus and passed away. She said, we honestly didn't even know he was gay until the funeral. They had a funeral at a Sacred Hearts Church in Southampton. And she said, my mother, who was an old-fashioned Irish woman, she said, we really didn't know much about his life. It turned out he was this man. I don't know if you can see this picture here. His name was Clement Ryan. And he was an attorney and a real estate mogul, and left her a number of homes with these paintings, different paintings. He was a Georgetown graduate, New York law school guy, and got sick and died unexpectedly. So, well, he knew he was dying, but he became sick. We found tickets flying back and forth on the Concorde to Paris. He was, trying to get better. So what little she gave me about it, she didn't know where he got the painting, but she did give us a few names of people who worked with him or may have known. And a lot of that became dead ends, who was dead, who had passed on. And so this is a picture of, this is a little book, some books I've written. I don't know if you can you see that, Jim? That's a picture of Mary Ryan.
Mary Ryan, yes, yeah, I think so.
So one of his partners we tracked down, and he said to me, I absolutely know where he got the painting. He got it from the actress Brooke Byron, who was one of our clients. So we went down this road to track down who this Brooke Byron might be. And we found out that she lived on a place at 1100 Park Avenue in New York City, amongst other places. Some of her addresses were in Palm Beach. She had an address in Bridgehampton. She had a home in Watermill at 65 Montrose Place in Watermill. And I said, do you recall the painting? And he said, yes. It hung in, Clem had it hanging in his office at 692 Montauk Highway in around 1971 till 79. And then he moved it to what became his new home office, which is where he died. So one of the questions was, why would somebody take a painting like this and move it to the garage? And I think we answered that. About 2 weeks in, I got a call from Mary Ryan, and she says to me, I think I realized why he moved that painting there. She said he had begun a renovation on the floor, and they were doing some jackhammering and stuff, and he moved a number of things to the garage. Because that was a question that needed to be answered. Why would somebody take a painting if they knew it was this, you know? Here's a, I don't know if you can see this, well, this is the photo of the office where it hung. So it became more interesting when we realized who owned the painting. She was an actress. We have a number of her photos. These are some of the photos of her in the background under the painting. I don't know if you can see it.
Mhm.
Interestingly, this photo, can you see that, Jim?
Yeah, sort of. Not very well.
But
It conflicts with the green screen thing.
it's important because this photo is her coming out of a building in 1939 with an actor named Alan Marshall, an Australian actor. But what's interesting about this photo is it's taken at Culver City Studios. That building is now owned by Jeff Bezos and Amazon.
Mhm.
One of the most historic buildings in California. And here she is coming out of that. So as we began to delve into her life, she was a woman of wealth, died with plenty of money, developed Alzheimer's in 10 years before she passed in 2006. So she had Alzheimer's from around 1996. So we began to try and get a trajectory of her to Jackson Pollock. We've since found photos of her on the same beach that Jackson Pollock was with in East Hampton. We have a photo of her sitting with Marilyn Monroe in the sand. So she lived out there. She was definitely in the vicinity of, definitely had the money. But what really, really became interesting was, for the longest time, we weren't certain who she was married to. We had been told by one of her living nieces she was married to a guy, but gave me the wrong spelling of the name. And it wasn't until, I would say, 5 or 6 years ago, we discovered she was married to a Russian aristocrat named Yura Arkus Duntov. Some of you might know the name because it turns out his brother was considered the godfather of the Corvette. Very, very wealthy Russian family.
He designed the Corvette.
He designed the Corvette.
Let me jump in here, Tony. I think we can all get into this case in great detail, but the bottom line, just to summarize, you've tracked down, you've done about as much as humanly possible in terms of getting the provenance.
With the provenance. In the meantime, right, you want to get into
also gotten the forensics updated. What's the latest on the forensic? What did Bureau do?
So Bureau tested the painting over a number of years.
Mm-hmm.
In 2013, 8 layers deep, there's a painting underneath here, almost in a geometrical type of design. We were advised to send it to London, where they have the updated material. My wife and I brought it to London. It was brought to Dr. Nicholas Eastow. Alexandra, I'm sure you know who Dr. Eastow is. Well, you may have heard of him, or Jillian.
I mean, this isn't really my field. What I am thinking about is how it compares to forgers. You know, anything that can be traced can also be faked. So
Right.
I'm thinking specifically of a forger named Wolfgang Beltracchi, who.
Right. Nicholas is actually the guy who uprooted Beltracchi in a way that Beltracchi got away with forgeries for years, right? He did Max Ernst, he did everything. And they brought one of the paintings on that subject was bought by Steve Martin at Christie's auction house and later sold to a company in Greece called Trasco, who then took it because they needed to get insurance on it. And the insurance company wanted to validate it was from the period. So they took it to Nicholas in London, who immediately recognized a white pigment, a titanium pigment in the painting, which came long after the artist. So Nicholas is the one who busted that entire case open. You could read up on that, the Beltracci forgery.
One thing that stuck out to me in the forgeries is he would pose his partner in like old timey clothes and like
Yes.
make like grainy pictures of her so that
Yes.
they could, what you're doing is you're finding, what you're saying is completely real pictures of people in the era interacting with people that had these works. What he
Right.
was
A
doing is
lot of
just
these
slowly
pictures.
inventing relatives and celebrities to authenticate false works. So that's
Right.
how
A lot of these photos were purchased online and have the original writings on the back of them, stapled to it with the actual stamp and the date, so you can actually see the photos and put them, you know, from that period where they came from. But yes, Beltracci, what he did was would put, you know, dress his wife up and take photos and then put the picture on the wall and photograph it and say, well, it came from her grandmother in 1913.
So who could be responsible for the underlying painting? That would be pretty hard to forge, would it not?
Well, if you go on to read, you read that in one of Pollock's in this Pollock book here from L&M Fine Galleries, in the first chapter, it says, in 1949, Jackson Pollock went over at least 14 paintings. You know, back then he didn't have a lot of money, right? And they would use whatever canvas they had available. One of his most famous paintings, Alcmene, since they've studied it in Venice, Italy, they found that it's not even a canvas. It's almost like curtains with a floral design on it, which he actually painted over. So you can assume that if he painted over it once, he painted over it twice, painted over it 14 times, there's a painting underneath here that's consistent with Jackson Pollock. I don't really want to go into what it is. We know what it is. But when Nicholas took the X-ray in London, he specifically said, you need to try and figure out what the painting underneath is. And if not, then we want to get deep into the binding meeting to find out, maybe our hope was there was a signature. You know, was there a Lee Krasner signature underneath? Was there, you know, somebody was close to Pollock underneath, a Gertrude Glass Green, anybody's name that we can, you know, it would help in the authenticity. Now, one of the things I love about the painting underneath is if you had 10 paintings and they mimicked or forged this painting through photographic means or whatever, only one of them in a court of law would stand up. And that would be the painting with the painting underneath, because nobody can copy it. The only person that could see it is the person doing the X-ray. We had the X-ray. We were hopeful that it had his signature underneath or something. But Alexandra, you know that Pollock often didn't sign a lot of his works, right? In the catalog, you can find a number that say not signed.
So there are two things that come to mind for me. One is that Pollock took him a really long time to develop his personal style. The splatters that everybody knows were just a fraction of a really difficult career where he wasn't finding his thing. And only when he finally did this thing was the thing. So I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I know the backstory a little bit of this underpainting that you're talking about, but in theory, it would make sense for this particular artist because he was always doing different stuff. The other thing that I think is important for people who don't know this to recognize is that underpainting is a very common method of understanding a work and authenticating a work. In the Salvatore Mundi that we were talking about earlier, in Italian, they call it pietamento. I mean, I feel like Tony probably speaks good Italian, but it's a change, right? It's a change of heart in terms of how you make a stroke. So like he's saying, when you're creating a work for the first time, if you're drawing a picture, anybody, you change your mind. And if you're making a copy, you don't. because you know exactly how it's supposed to look. And that's one of the signatures that people look for when authenticating a painting. Did this come to you organically, or were you replicating something that you knew from the beginning?
Right. Well, it's very hard to copy or mimic a Pollock. I mean, everybody drips it a different way, but certain things that they've come to the conclusion is he often liked to marble or the black and the yellow in his paintings, and and so the painting chemically tested. Bureau is confident it was painted in 1950, 51. Give or take a couple of months here and there. What we found out, the actress was married on March 1st, 1946 to this Russian aristocrat. So my thought is, and what really, really triggered me was, we found out that his mother was, and Jim, this is again off the science, but the provenance is really just as important. His mother was the Minister of Cultural Affairs in Russia. She had access to everyone. She was a one-time, lover of Marc Chagall. We have all the documentation of this. That is key, just as key as to the painting underneath, the forensics. It's a combination. It really is a three-legged stool to authenticity.
Yeah. Let's talk about, let me just jump to the bottom line here. Bureau thinks the painting is real. He's written glowing letters about it. I don't want to go into the whole Bureau story,
Right.
but this is kind of sets up the issue here, which is science versus subjective authentication.
Perfect.
And so talk about the reception that you got in the art world when you started asking, institutions of, like IFAR and so forth to authenticate. Yeah.
Well, part of the dilemma is that
the catalog, the big picture is the Pollock Foundation has gotten.
Anybody won't accept the painting if it's not cataloged, even though they know there's a number of paintings that escape the catalogs. Right. Now, that goes back to who controls the catalog. Who are these people that control what is and what isn't real? Who says that the Monday's real? Who says what it's worth? That's a creation of what authenticity has brought about. And it goes back to, again, what you said before, the Wild Wild West. There's no regulation. There's no government entity that you could take it to and say, hey, is it worth this? Is it worth that? One of the things you missed before, Jim, and I got to say this, was, you talked about art and the value and what it's. Art is very easy to transfer. I had somebody tell me, I'd rather have a painting for $400 million than have to build condos and get permits and sell every one of the units in Miami Beach. This is an important thing. Art is important to those people who want to move art for financial gain.
Just to put a fine point on that, we've had scandals involving money launderers who are using basically Picassos,
right?
And swapping them back and forth, and forged Picassos,
right,
as the perfect way. If you really have $50 million to launder, what's the easiest way to do it? You say, right. I sold my Picasso, right?
Right, and there's a great video, Alexandra, if you want to watch this. It's a phenomenal piece. It's on David Stein, who is one of the greatest Picasso forgers of all time, and it was shot in 1971 by Maurice Schaefer. I don't know if you've seen it, Jim. I think
I think everybody can watch on Netflix right now. Is called Made You Look, about the Nodlers.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's really important because that contradicts what you're saying, right? What you've done, from what you're saying right now, you've quantified every aspect of this. You've done all the qualitative research. You've done everything you could possibly do, but you lack cachet. You don't know these guys. You don't go to those galleries. You haven't built trust over decades.
Exactly.
What happened with the Nodler scandal, the Nodler Gallery was the antithesis of that. You could walk along Central Park, and I remember thinking when I used to walk by it when I was but your age in college, I was like, how is it that they just possess all of these 20th century works? Like, how could you just go in there and it's like floor to ceiling, Rothko, Pollock, you name it. It's just wild to me. And that was the correct instinct because they weren't real. And the thing that happened was that this art dealer, Anne Friedman, who had run Nodler her whole life, her entire career,
right,
wanted to believe what she wanted to believe. Now, some people are like, listen, this was clearly intent on her part. She knew that all these paintings were fake, and she just, she got in too deep and she had to do what she had to do.
Right.
Whatever you think, the point is they had networks. They had fashion executives. They had art specialists. They had people that trusted one another, not baselessly, but almost blindly, because you had so many years together.
Right.
But if you came to them with things missing, it didn't matter because they trusted you. So in your case, I mean, this is a harsh way of saying it, but like nobody trusts you because they don't know you. But even though you have all of your ducks in a row,
Right.
there's still so much room for error. Now, you could say that it's because of what happened with Knoedler, right? That people have been burned. And if anything looks remotely sketchy, if you don't have the track record, if someone comes out of thin air with something from the attic, then they don't, which is what you're saying. They're saying, listen, it's not in the catalog raisonné. We've never heard of you. We've never heard of this work. I have to pass on it. There's just something fishy about it. But then you look at Knoedler and there were just like
And their
whole
provenance
oceans of
was-
fishiness, and
Their
nobody.
provenance was Mr. X. I mean, if you were
I mean-
buying a painting for $18 million, who is it? Well, it's
Right.
Mr. X. Give me a break. I mean, I know this painting was owned by her specifically and loved by her. And we've actually tracked down a living niece who sent me photos of her sitting in front of another Pollock. And probably, we're trying to pinpoint the gallery. It looks like it could be Leo, what was his name? The big gallerist back in the day. Cantor's.
Castelli?
What?
Leo Castelli? Is that who you
Yeah. It could have been in there or one of those galleries. But
Let me jump in with two stories. One has to do with sitting on a bus going to the Hamptons one day, and a lady next to me must have been in her 80s. And I started talking about this story with the Pollock issue and how do you get authenticated when the catalog has been closed since 1996, and the authentication outfits are dominated by people who also own Pollocks and not interested in finding new ones. And she said, "Oh yeah, I went to a party at Jackson Pollock's house in New York. It must have been about 1953, 54, something like that. And he had a bunch of young lovelies with him. We all went home to his studio, and he threw a canvas on the floor and started throwing paintings, drippings on it in the middle of his apartment. And he said, 'See that? Somebody's going to pay me $4,000 for that.'"
Yeah.
That was like, okay. Story two has to do with one of our missing witnesses today, Jason, who did a phenomenal series on the Getty Museum, in which he documented the fact that there was a whole bunch of people who were taking advantage of the fact that you can donate highly valued art to foundations and get tax write-offs. Some of these abuses have now been, sort of shut down, but there still is a basic practice in the industry. So in the 1990s, I was going to an apartment party in New York. A friend of mine, very wealthy guy, had inherited everything. And he had like 3 apartments in the same building in Park Avenue. And I said, "Well, Josh, what do you got in the other apartments?" And he said, "Well, I'll show you." So we went in, and he opens up the door, and there is this whole room full of African art. And I said, "Well, wow, I didn't know you loved African art. I do too. I go to Africa all the time." And he said, no, this is a tax write-off. I basically can decide how much these things are valued. I get an appraiser to set a price for them, and then we just donate it to a friendly local foundation.
That's illegal though. Like
Well,
there's a difference between somebody being like, okay, I'm going to donate to a museum because I love art. And yes, I have, it's in my tax benefit to do that for the masses. And there's a different than somebody just opening.
I would say
I don't care about any of this.
I don't disagree that the whole intentional manipulation of appraisals is illegal, and that's what our friend was going to talk about today. But even when exposed, this kind of behavior has been going on for decades, and it's only gotten to be more of a game that people have played with valuations, given the fact that the valuations have soared, and the valuations themselves are to some extent in the eyes of the beholder. So if you look at the valuation of African art, it has in fact soared. So will someone come along and say that the random piece that somebody bought for $1,000 in Kenya, is not worth, 500,000? I think there's a genuine perplexity here. This is an imperfect market. We're talking about what do you do about that? I'm not sure there's an easy answer.
Jim, I just want to say, I think what Alexandra's trying to say is not everybody's a bad apple in the art world.
Right.
Not everybody's out to dodge taxes, and there are people that love paintings. I love paintings. My favorite artist of all time, Toulouse-Lautrec. I hope to own one of his pieces one day. A fascinating guy. I love it. I love looking at it. I love this painting because it has a story. For 16 years, we've held on to it. It's become like one of our children. We love to look at it. We love to bring it out for Christmas and celebrate it. And you do fall in love with certain pieces of art. It's like having a dog, an animal. You don't want to get rid of it. It's very hard.
Okay, but then I raise you the question, what would incentivize you to put your child in a museum? And then
what do you mean?
Like, you love this thing so much. The MoMA calls and they say, okay, we want to display it. And you're like, but it's in my living room and we all enjoy it. What would galvanize that for you?
Well, here's what would galvanize.
Yeah.
It needs to be shared with the world. It's just an incredible story, an incredible journey. It altered the course of my life. And it would be my dream to have Alice Walton call up and say, I'd love to show it at Crystal Bridges, and put out the white ropes and the red ropes and the carpet. And I guarantee you, people will come from around the world. The history and the story behind this actress, she is really the story. She came from nothing and went on to become a very, very, famous in her own right actress.
Let me ask, Harrison.
Her husband was the Russian aristocrat who was the president of the Dreyfus Fund before it was even the Dreyfus Fund.
Yeah.
These were not type of people to own a fake piece of art back in 1950 or 51. When you begin to put the pieces to the puzzle together, you come up with the conclusion. They lived on Park Avenue. They lived on 60-something Place South. The year was 1950. His mother was the Minister of Cultural Affairs. What better provenance is that? When Mr. X sells for $18 million. It's just a matter of acceptance.
Sorry, let me get
I just want to say this. I had somebody come and see the painting. She was with a major museum for many years. She literally fainted in my arm. She said, where did you get that painting? And then she said to me, where is David Geffen in all of this? I said, I don't know. He's a huge Pollock collector. Maybe he thinks it's fake. Maybe the one on his wall, it doesn't go with it. I don't know. Like, people know it's out there. It's just a matter of, in the end, a true masterpiece has to reveal itself. So when it gets exposed, it doesn't matter if it's me or Jim who owned it or anybody else. It'll speak for itself. It will sing for itself.
Harrison.
Hi, thank you.
Ed Harrison.
This is extraordinary on so many dimensions, and I feel like the art world sort of operates. It seems at this sort of weird, like, margin of reality in some ways, but also in terms of museum, right, and in people's faces. and that's quite interesting. And I want to go back to the question of NFTs, but also regulation and stuff. And like, I really liked your point about, you know, people just loving art, and I don't understand why it's so difficult for us to maintain that and sort of at least regulate this in some way without perhaps losing some of the magic of it. Like, it seems like with NFTs, the sort of market is moving towards the sort of decentralized trend, which is fine. It can probably be regulated to some extent in that way. But yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or like what you would like to see happen so that this doesn't become just like this insane playground of the rich.
Alexandra, can you take that first, and then Tony?
I don't think being an insane playground for the rich, and no, I don't think it's mutually exclusive with taxing. I mean, there's a reason we're all in this room talking about it. Lots of cooks are in the kitchen recalibrating and trying to understand things through the eyes of law or finance or what have you. I don't think it's as unregulated as the academics like to say. The first person you could talk to about that is art dealers. They are like up to their nose in paperwork that they never had to deal with, and every year it gets more complicated. I don't think it's as black and white as nobody's watching. I think we're all watching. And to that end, I think that NFTs are a reaction to that. That it's part of the reason the traditional art world is so excited about this new frontier is that they need a new frontier because everything else is so not just scrupulous, but also traditional. You know, the NFT is the first thing that it's like a new medium. So I don't think there's going to be some massive crackdown. I think there's one way to change behavior. I think, unfortunately, the nature of having expendable income is that double-edged sword where you want to appreciate it and enjoy it, and you want to invest it and continue to grow it. And sometimes those spectrums come together where, you know, well, if I have a painting, I might as well have a painting I can flip and make more money on. Or if I'm going to store my wealth, I might as well store it in the art that I was already planning to buy. Or, you know, those things do converge inevitably. And that's a behavioral question rather than a law enforcement question. But ultimately, the real issue, at least in the United States right now, is that the store of wealth of extremely wealthy people is not coming back to the community. And yes, there are philanthropists who have done charity work and buy art. You know, they're not only hoarding money when they could be giving it away. They do both. People can appreciate beauty and help communities. But unfortunately, looking at these huge profit margins on artwork and looking at the income gaps and the struggles of communities, I think that's what I would like to try to figure out what went wrong on as a lawmaking question. And do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, and this might be well, a couple of thoughts. Like, I can see what you mean about like the ultra rich and stuff, and it feels like it's a bit more of like a broader question of these sort of global tax havens, which we've been talking about in this class. But I was just wondering, like, a very quick question of like, there's no like, I'm sure there's no wealth tax on art, right? But is there like a proposal for a wealth tax on art, or would a wealth tax include art? Like, that seems like, especially because art is obviously something that
That's the answer.
appreciates, you know.
Yeah.
There are taxes.
There are proposals for wealth taxes on art. The narrow version of the tax of the wealth tax proposed by Senator Wyden in Congress now only taxes publicly traded wealth like stocks and bonds. But one of the tricky things is that the more aggressive wealth taxes are trying to extend that to valuations of real estate and other collectibles and art and private companies, and a whole lot of private wealth and debt at the very top of the income distribution is very hard to value. So one of the issues we're dealing with right now is, do we leave these things aside? And I don't think there's a simple question, but I think that many of the wealth taxes that have been proposed are basically full employment programs for lawyers. They're not easy to implement, and they're not going to generate, anything like the kind of revenue that has been expected from them in any time soon. So, Tony, you wanted to comment on?
Yeah, quick. From what I hear now, under these, and Jim's a specialist on this, but the bank secrecy laws, you're going to have to identify where the painting comes from in the near future. I think in Europe they started that, whereby you can no longer, value yourself and who you are. I don't know if Alexandra, if you've heard that, they're trying to pass laws in that direction where, hey, the painting was sold by, Tony to such and such. And, a lot of paintings in history have a provenance that, just says, from a private collector, or Christie's or Sotheby's advertised the painting from. No longer will they really be able to do that. It needs to be documented where the painting came from, and on another note, I was once showed somebody the painting, and they said to me, you're a regular guy, you have 4 kids or a family man. Had this painting been owned by John F. Kennedy Jr., it would have been sold yesterday, like tomorrow. And, it's been 16 years, and it goes against that, wealth against the little person, sort of, to say, you don't fit in with that group. Another person told me, you own a painting that escaped the cabal. I said, what do you mean? They said, imagine 10 balloons going up, and they go up together and they land in the same spot. Yours took a left turn and escaped the cabal. And that there is another dilemma that we've had to deal with, who we are, the little guy against the art world, which is great. It's part of the story. We love the painting. We still get to look at it. We still get to enjoy it every day with the story behind it. We know it to be true, and we've done everything we could. I think the forensics, and one other thing, Jim, I wanted to go back to, you had showed that graph Alexandra put up in 2008. A lot of that was attributed to the downturn in the market, but a lot of that was also attributed to a lot of the fakes and frauds through science were being discovered, and people were hesitant to buy during that period. I had a gentleman, a very, very wealthy gentleman, tell me, I said, well, he was talking about insurance. I said, insurance on a painting. And he goes, well, I don't care if it's fake, if it's proven fake or real. I own the insurance company. He says, and that's another angle where they come from, like another person said to me, a major dealer, would take this painting tomorrow. I said, well, I'm trying to get to the bottom of the history. So, we want to be truthful. He says, he doesn't care if it's real or not. He just cares that it's sellable. So there's all of these different things. And you wonder, did you spend 16 years of your life searching for something that doesn't really matter? Because
the assumption by people like Bureau and yourself was always that the art market was really interested in the question of authenticity, that at some level proving all this, getting the right answer. Let me just finish. Just finish. And when we had Bureau, getting involved in really a hatchet job that was written about him by the New Yorker magazine.
Right.
When we look at the reasons for that, I think a lot of it came back to the fact that Bureau had the chutzpah to stand in that film you described with a side-by-side comparison of Pollock authenticated in the catalog owned by Cy Newhouse.
Cy Newhouse, who owned the New Yorker.
And the painting by Terry, which was not authenticated and is still to this day in limbo.
Well, I've recently heard that somebody's producing a movie about that, the vindication of Terry Horton. And I wonder if it's, if it's been sold or it's being sold. Alexandra, can you add to that? Do you know if it's been sold or?
Sorry, which work is being sold?
The Terry Horton Pollock.
I don't know the Pollock market at all. I mean, there's so much I could comment on. I also want to make sure we answer Harrison's question. You raised a really important point about the global reality of art and how there's no one jurisdiction. That's a big problem with antiquities, particularly because trying to trace the provenance of an object that's like 5,000 years old. Is it Greek? Is it Roman? Is it Turkish? The Roman Empire was vast. Different empires came from different places that as time goes by, they have new political realities and new financial realities. That also is true in, again, global offshore wealth, right? If you have a trust, maybe you live in the United States, but you have property in Switzerland where you built out the trust that's actually registered in Cyprus. And then you have, I mean, you could like go chasing the world. I literally did chase the world when I wrote the book. I went to Singapore and I went to Switzerland.
It
You know,
was a fascinating book,
get
by the
there,
way.
it's impossible.
Alexandra, it's a fascinating research. You've done a wonderful job in that book.
Thank you.
For those of
I
you who
had a
don't
lot of
know,
fun traveling.
book-
And but, you know, if you like, I think that movie, The Laundromat, they try to physically show you the trajectory of wealth is a tailspin because you're not always there. You're not physically there. So when you're trying to tax somebody in their country or where the money is stored, that could be a myriad places. That could be all kinds of things. Now, there was also the question of anonymity that you raised, and I'll tie this into what I think is Harrison's question about inherited wealth. So why would you want it to be anonymous? I brought this up earlier. Why would you want to hide it from a museum? Maybe you don't want them to know that you're the guy with the $1 million Pollock. You don't want them calling you. Maybe you don't want Uncle Jim bothering you to try to get his cut of the Pollock. Maybe you don't want the Chinese government to find you because, you know, China, if they're upset with you, they could just seize all your assets. There are many reasons you would want things under wraps. Now, if you pass away and you pass that wealth on, who it goes to might be even private as well. So in the case of, and this is, again, now I'm answering Harrison's question about how you value something after somebody dies. Death, debt, and divorce. I don't know if anyone else had an accountant dad who taught them that, but those are the three movers of money: death, debt, divorce, because that's when everything gets totaled again, and that's what you have to do. And in death, you pass it on to your descendants, and maybe there's drama as to who gets what and who wants what. In Rivlov's case, it's particularly interesting because he had divorce and death kind of mapped out with his anonymous trust structure. He had everything in his art collection under his older daughter's name. So in the divorce, he could say, it's not mine, it's my daughter's. You know, with his New York City penthouse, it's not mine, it's my daughter's. And actually the picture that you posted earlier, I don't know if you did that on purpose, Jim, that was his daughter. Which is sometimes hard to tell because he had a lot of girlfriends in Monaco who all looked a lot like that. But you can register things to whoever you want, wherever you want, for either their gain, your gain, or just full-blown anonymity.
Let me let Jonah have a question here. He's another student here. Jonah?
Yeah, sorry if this is a bit off topic, but I'm wondering if any artists alive today sort of like foresee this problem and take matters to make sure that their art will always be authentic. Like, do they do any sort of like special markings or something?
Let me just mention that authentication in that sense has probably become easier.
Yes.
If artists really pay attention to it. The issue is that a lot of artists just don't know this stuff and they don't have any patience for it. They think it's a little bit beneath them to worry about the commercial aspects of their work. I've had that opinion from very talented artists, and so there ought to be some effort put into making some resources available to artists who are never going to be, you know, in the authentication business, in the NFT business, just because they've kind of looked down their noses at it, or just don't have the time or the technical resources to master that. Tony.
Somebody suggested take a piece of your hair if you're an artist, embed it in the binding medium of the paint, and leave it there for years. Get it out of your fingerprint.
Sure.
So it really depends on the artist and the collector. Like some collectors are just messes, total train wrecks of human beings. You kind of have to be if you want to accumulate a million things. Like yeah. Hoarding. The hoarding gene might be a requirement for becoming a collector of anything. I don't have the collecting gene, as you can see. I'm like very minimalist. Like I love to talk about art, but I will not be the person that has more art than their space can handle, I don't think. those people are sloppy with their records more often than not. And that was sort of the birth of the anonymous Swiss collector concept. It's a real thing. Like, you forget where it was. You're squirreling away your art and you have no idea whose it is or where you got it. And, you know, I think a lot of the law enforcement narrative, the archaeologist narrative, people who are anti-market say, that's just a vehicle for offshore wealth. It's developed out of reality and necessity, especially before criminality was so pulled back and people realized the extent that you could do things. Things were traded without any records at all. So I don't know if the question, Jonah, was also tied to the NFT thing and how encryption is a big part of the sell. You know, if you encrypt this with NFTs, it beats a pile of papers. It beats even a hair. It's, you know, this is digitized and it will live forever. I am still maybe just unfamiliar with that technology, so I can't speak to its efficacy. And I think one of the reasons I can't is because nobody really understands it. Like, there's such a small number of people who really know how NFTs work. So how could it be the encryption to end all encryption if we can't ever read it? You know, I think it'll take years for us to catch up to the technology in that sense. So the methodology varies, you know, from the 1600s old master painting seals to the pile of papers from Granny in her crazy house, floor to ceiling of masterpieces, to NFTs. I think there are many ways that people try to ensure that their work has a clear narrative, but that's just the nature of bookkeeping in general.
That's a good summary. Well, we're out of time here. I think we could go on. There are several issues we haven't explored in nearly enough detail, but the art world poses a lot of fundamental challenges to traditional economics. I think one of the things we're struggling with is, you know, what is the role of wealth inequality in financing a lot of this stuff? It's true that the demand for anonymity is partly driven by legitimate needs, but it is also greatly driven by the availability of free ports where you can hide and avoid excise taxes and other taxes. The issue of whether creators in general get their fair share of anything in a world that's dominated by, you know, fast capitalism, well, probably always dominated by expropriators. That's a traditional issue that no one has solved, and especially not in the art world, but there's no shortage of examples of where people who are in some sense, the original sources of creativity and works of art or literature do not get their fair share of the ultimate value of that. And so we have a society in which this issue is constantly before us again. We haven't solved it here, but I think we've raised the question of what is it exactly that is we're talking about when we talk about utility. Why is it that people buy what they buy? Is collection a sociopathy, or is it something we should all sort of try to look closer at as a commendable activity, collection of art as a source of support for the art world? I think all of these questions have been raised in this discussion, and it's certainly a problem for global justice. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Tony. Thank you,
Okay.
Alexandra. Thank you, students.
Okay, thank you.